You love her voice, you love her looks, what Melissa loves are comic books. Hi, everybody. Welcome to 2026. Oh, wished it was better. Anyways, here I am in my den. I've done a little decorating since the last time you were here. Last time you would have noticed a picture of Thor from a cover on the floor over here. Now it's on the wall over here. I've got Captain America over here, and over here I've got a plaque of Action Comics #1 on the wall. So if you were actually here, you would see that clockwise around the room it goes in chronological order. And as anyone that knows me knows, chronology is really important to me. But this video is not about just showing you my room. It's about what we talked about 2 episodes ago. And that was when I mentioned that all the creators in Action Comics #1 were willing to work for cheap. But was that really true? Let's look into that more in this episode as we examine the rest of the contents of Action Comics #1. Last episode, we talked about the Superman story that led off this anthology book. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were 23, with little on their resumes other than comic book material. And while I'm a big fan of Dr. Occult and Spy, none of their pre-Superman work had created much excitement. And we've talked about the Superman story already, so we'll not continue that now. But right after Superman was Chuck Dawson, created by Homer Fleming. Fleming was no 20-something trying to break into the business. He was 55 and had been in the comic strip business for about 20 years. In the 1920s, he was the artist on a strip that no one remembers today called Craig Kennedy, about a crime-solving chemistry professor, which actually sounds really cool, and I wish that I could find that online. By the mid-1930s, Fleming is doing one-panel cartoons for some newspapers, but clearly needs a little supplemental income since he never hit the big time with comic strips. And this side hustle started with National when he did Captain Jim of the Texas Rangers, Sandor of the Lost Civilization, and the Magic Crystal of History. The first 2 of those I've already talked about in previous episodes. But he was far from their star artist. So he was in a position where he would be willing to pick up some extra work for cheap, right? In this issue, Chuck Dawson has begun to think about taking up the fight against the crooked cattleman who killed his father. He rides back into Red Gulch on his horse Blackie, immediately gets into a fight, and is warned to leave by the sheriff. An evil rancher overhears who Chuck is and sends 2 of his men to kill him. Chuck defeats one, but a bullet from the other creases his skull and knocks him out. The first bullet creases your skull and knocks you out in comics. Chuck wakes up in jail, but tricks and overpowers the deputy so he can escape. To be fair here, I have shared this before, by the way, I am not a fan of Westerns, so I naturally am biased against Chuck Dawson. And I keep saying Chuck Dawson as if it's in quotation marks because it really is. I think the most interesting thing about him is that Chuck is apparently not his first name, but his nickname, maybe short for Chuck Wagon. Fred Guardineer is who I'm going to talk about next. And I've talked about him in past episodes, as he was the artist on Don Hastings, and in my opinion was far and away the best artist in Chesler Studios' stable. By the spring of 1938, Guardineer is illustrating about half the contents of Star Comics, but is mostly filler and illustrations for text stories. His talents are being criminally underused. So when he hears that Detective Comics is looking for a 12-page feature with a new character, Guardineer must have leapt at the chance. And the chance that he took was to come up with a Mandrake clone, the first in comics. Zatara, Master Magician. Zatara is a magic user, wears a tuxedo, has a manservant named Tong instead of Lothar. At least in this first appearance, relies largely on hypnosis when he casts spells, and fights crime for seemingly no reason other than that he can. In his crystal ball, he can see crimes before they happen, which seems to give him a significant advantage and also cuts back on the amount of story time that he has to spend investigating things. He also already has a nemesis, a female thief called the Tigress. She has absolutely no powers or magic at all. She's just sneaky. And since we already know Zatara has a crystal ball, that makes it seem like he must not be trying very hard to find her and stop her in advance. Zatara in this first appearance lacks the mustache that he will soon get that will make him look even more like Mandrake. He will also rely on magic more in future installments. Here he also relies on a lot more physicality, jumping from train to train, defending himself with a gun, showing he has escape artist skills. It's the moments when Zatara doesn't use magic that strike me as the most interesting ones. Maybe he doesn't have a short range teleport spell that can get him from train to train. Maybe he carries a gun because his combat spells have limited range to them. Like superheroes, comic book magicians are also going to experience power inflation very quickly. Soon Zatara's magic will have none of the limitations seemingly implied here, but it's the limitations that I think really make him more interesting. Sticky Mitt Stimson is four-page joke filler that also kind of doubles as a story. Stimson is an apple thief who gets chased by a police officer for 4 pages, but in the end gets away because of mistaken identity. I've talked about Elger, which was the pen name for Russell Cole, before. Cole was 50, nearly as old as Homer Fleming was, had only worked for National his entire career in comics, and while I really like his style, um, maybe it was just too different for everyone else. Cole disappeared from comic books by 1941. Next, we get a 4-page story, The Adventures of Marco Polo by Sven Elven, another person I've talked about before. Sven Elven was born Hubert Frickholm in Stockholm, Sweden, and changed his name to Sven Elven sometime after immigrating to the US. He was a book illustrator before he started working for National, right from the beginning of the company. He stayed with National to 1940, briefly worked for Fawcett, then tried to move over to Centaur Comics in 1941 before they folded. At that point, Sven gave up on comic books and worked for an electric company. It seems like Sven was not in great demand in comics, and it's likely that when he was given the chance to do any pages in Action Comics, he probably snagged that up as fast as he could too. Sven seemed to like to dabble in literary adaptations, as he also did Robin Hood, Treasure Island, and The Three Musketeers. This isn't going to be a straight adaptation, though. There's a reason this is called The Adventures of Marco Polo instead of The Travels of Marco Polo, which was the actual name of the book. The first 3 pages are travelogue, like the travel of Marco Polo was, but condensed to about 1 year per page. And then the action slows down, so that we can see Marco and his men doing real action, dealing with bandits who ambush them in a narrow pass. Fred Guardineer, at last, had a company that seemed to value his talent and gave him all the page count he wanted, because not only did he get the 12-page Zatara slot, but they also handed him Pep Morgan for a new relaunch of the character. I have talked about Pep Morgan before as well, but that was a very different character, a comedic character who appeared in more fun comics until issue 29, just 4 months earlier. Now that Pep Morgan is being relaunched, he's here as a serious adventure strip character. Pep is still described as a versatile young athlete, so even though he's a boxer in this adventure, it opens the door for him to be involved in other sports later on. And he's not just an amateur boxer, he's the light heavyweight champion of the world, which must have surprised John Lewis, who was the real world light heavyweight champion of the world at the time. Pep even gets to fight a villainous boxer with a super villainy name, Boomerang, whose gimmick is drugging his opponents with a syringe hidden in his glove. It's a good thing he didn't call himself Syringe, because that would have gave everything away. The Grand Comics database credits the writing of this feature to Gardner Fox instead of Fred Guardineer. You'll hear lots more about Gardner Fox in the future. This might be true, though I think Guardineer was equally capable of writing this feature. Will Will Eli, or Ellie, possibly, Ely, is yet another artist I've talked about before. He has started drawing for National in 1937, taking over Sandra the Service and Jack Woods, and adding Johnny Law for More Fun Comics, Dale Daring for New Adventure Comics, and Larry Steele for Detective Comics. The suddenness of his expansive presence all across National's small line of comics speaks volumes to Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson's confidence in his abilities. But Wheeler Nicholson, as we know, is not in charge anymore. Would the new management feel the same? Eli must have been understandably nervous when he was told he was losing Jack Woods the same month Action Comics came out, but that turned out to be so that he could draw Scoop Scanlon, five-star reporter. It might seem strange to feature a second reporter character in a title that already has Clark Kent in it, but Scoop is a very different character. First of all, he works for an even more generic newspaper, The Bulletin. Scoop lacks the power of agency, obviously, that Superman has. Here he can only assist the police in saving the day instead of being a lone hero. The scenario seems like an exciting one, with Tommy gun wielding international jewel thieves and a car chase, but it looks stiff and kind of motionless in Eli's relatively inexperienced hands. Most of the last page doesn't even get backgrounds. You would think that Vince Sullivan would take that as a sign that Eli was overworked, but instead he's about to get handed another feature, Nadir, Master of Magic, in New Adventure Comics. Now, the last feature is Tex Thompson, a rancher who got rich when he struck oil on his fields and uses the money to tour the world and seek adventure. Tex is the creation of Bernard Baily, someone who got his start in comics just last year, doing apprentice level inking in the Iger Eisner studio and very quickly being given a syndicated comic strip. That was every artist's dream, right? To strike it rich with a comic strip? Only this strip was Phyllis, a strip that no one's ever heard of, for Keystone Press Features, a syndicate that no one's ever heard of. So Bailey was wise to see that this was not going to be his ticket to riches, and at the age of 22, hedged his bets by taking this side job for Detective Comics. Given a generous 12 pages to work with, same as Zatara, Bernard opts for a slow start, introducing us to Tex by having him introduce himself to a stranger, which gives us the chance to see Tex's personality and way of speaking. On page 2, the plot begins in earnest, with Tex and the boy finding a dead body, and then this woman appears to accuse Tex of being the killer. The local sheriff also just happens to arrive then, and things look bad when Tex has to knock the sheriff out in order to escape to clear his name. Luckily, Tex is able to trail the woman to this shack hidden in the hills, and there he sees that she's meeting with three co-conspirators, and they're part of a gang. Tex manages to overpower one, gets his gun, and manages to take the gang prisoner. And the story would be over in 7 pages, except he's got 5 more to fill. So to pad it out, Tex is distracted and overpowered instead. The story shifts to the boy Bobby going to find help, but ultimately returning to the hills and trying to help Tex alone. We find out just how strong Tex is when he sees Bobby in danger. Not Superman level strong, obviously, but he is able to flex and break the rope that is binding his wrists. He may be strong, and he does know a little jujitsu, or so he tells us, but 3-to-1 odds are a little too much for him, and he has to flee and hide in order to keep from being shot. Luckily, the sheriff arrives again in the nick of time. This time, he's wisely believing Tex. He does, however, shoot down the gang chief when the gang chief runs away, but he captures everyone else. He offers Tex a reward, but we learn something else about Tex when he offers the reward to Bobby and his friend Betty instead. I find that it's a relatively satisfying story, although Bailey does forget to tell us what the motive was for killing the man and who the man was in the first place. The Grand Comics database actually suggests that this story was written for Bailey by Ken Fitch, moonlighting from Chesler Studio the same way Fred Guardineer was. Though what it says is that this is Ken Fitch with a question mark. I can't say if it's right or not. It does seem like this story is different than the future stories. It's set up so that maybe Bobby and Betty were meant to be his child companions, but by next issue, they're gone, and he has a new sidekick instead, who will stay with Tex Thompson for the rest of the feature. I mean, the rest of the history of the feature. I do want to point out that, in my opinion, Bailey was only a mediocre artist, but I think that he knew this and tried to cover up for it by dousing his images in heavy shadows. which actually helps more often than it hurts, giving us silhouettes and long shadows that make these bad guys look more menacing than they do in broad daylight. The last two pages are filler done by Sheldon Moldoff, an artist who you'll also be hearing about a lot in the future. But we'll save that for another episode, and I've given you some things to chew over and names to remember for our future episodes. I hope to have the next one out sooner than this one, and I will see you then. So thanks for listening, and bye for now.